somebody turn on these fans as well, please? I would appreciate that. Is it just me, or is it really hot and humid in here?
Just you.
It just seems, of course, I sweat all the time, as you know, but still, it just seems overly so. The reason why I'm over here and not in the pulpit is I was discovering, as we did the scripture reading, that I really wasn't hearing much out of that microphone. And last week, I felt as if I had to yell. And I don't want to yell at you guys. Come on. So I'm going to be at this microphone today for the sermon and probably the rest of the service. And we'll solve all those things later on. I'm not worried about that. Well, today we deal with one of the most difficult things we have to do in our lives, forgiveness. So let us begin. Immaculée Ilbigezi was the 2007 recipient of the Mahatma Gandhi International Award for Peace and Reconciliation. She survived the terrifying Rwanda genocide, but all her family died. Her mother, her father, her grandparents, her brothers, her sisters, her uncles, her aunts. This is a quote from her. I was told that one of our former Hutu neighbors was the leader of a gang that had killed my mother and my brother. When I heard that he was being held in a local prison, I decided to go see him. I didn't know what I would do when I saw him face to face. When a guard brought the man from his cell, I hardly recognized this former neighbor, the father of children I had known as I was growing up. His hair was disheveled, and bits of food clung to his unshaven face. He stared at me defiantly. Then, when I quietly but sincerely said 3 short words, I forgive you, peace swept over my soul. I wanted to be free of hatred because I had seen what the hatred of this man and other Hutus had done. His defiant look melted away, and he bowed his head. I'm sure it was in shame for what he had done. Can you not see Joseph's brothers doing exactly the same? As I walked out of the prison, the Tutsi man who ran the prison turned to me in anger. How could you forgive him? The man had lost his children during the genocide. A year later, I met him again, and he told me that what I had done had changed his life. He had been so full of hate and anger that he was miserable. When he saw that I could forgive and move on with my life after all I had been through and lost, he knew this was also what he wanted to do. Forgiveness is the step we need to take to be free of the ongoing negative effects of past injustices. It has transformative qualities not found elsewhere. To decide to forgive is to create a different future from one controlled by the events from the past. It means remembering the past in a different way, leaving one free to develop the future. The person forgiven may not even appreciate what you have done and what has happened. It may not benefit that person, but the one who does the forgiving will always be rewarded with a greater degree of empowerment and personal growth in love and self-esteem. Now, it's too early. Things are still going on in this nation that are crazy. But the political turmoil we are experiencing will eventually end. It will end. And at the end of the turmoil, we'll have to make a decision too in our lives, whether to forgive or not. As the previous story revealed, forgiveness isn't as much for the forgiven as for the forgiver. And yet, as you heard Joseph's intense, heartfelt weeping, that weeping allowed his brothers to also weep and to make themselves vulnerable for the healing. What is it that prevents ourselves from forgiving? Resentment. Resentment is one of the most pernicious angers sickening our nation. It's a fire and brimstone filter over the eyes of our heart, preventing ourselves from ever feeling whole love again. Oh, there's a lust. Oh, indeed, there is a lust. The lust of revenge. That dark rage that simmers underneath perceived civility. You remember those movies, Star Wars and Darth Vader. What was it that turned Darth Vader to the dark side? It was his rage and anger that he made sure that he killed everyone that was even remotely identified with people that had killed his mother. And that resentment boiled up in him, and he felt such power and anger. But it was the dark side. It was the dark side of the Force. We saw later, when he was dying, that he was merely a shriveled man. So we'll have a choice of our own to make in the hopefully not too distant future. How do we deal with those who maintain fealty to people who espouse racist, white supremacist, Nazi, and KKK sympathies? How will we move from resentment towards forgiveness so we can move on with our whole loving lives intact? While it still may be too early to do that, I'd like us to imagine it. For in this day, we need to learn how to keep our humanity in the face of all this hate. Not an easy task, but we must learn, and we have one of the greatest teachers, Jesus Christ. First, I'd like to share a definition of compassion that has helped me deal with my own rage and resentments. I have felt that just as much as anyone. There is a definition of compassion that has been very helpful, that it's broken into three forms, and compassion is another term for love. The first is, compassion is tender in the face of pain. This is what we teach in school and in churches all the time. This is what we teach our children. Somebody is hurting. We feel tenderness towards that person. We feel love towards that person. How can we make the boo-boo better? Unfortunately, what has happened is we've been locked into that definition of compassion and love, and we have not realized that there are other forms of compassion that may be surprising to you. Compassion is also fierce in the face of injustice. Fierce in the face of injustice. I'm not saying violent. I'm not saying physically violent. But there comes a time when you see injustice that you must speak up and shout out. You shall not pass. This is unacceptable. The letter that you have in your bulletins from our conference minister, Sherry Prestman, she knows how to be fierce in the face of injustice. She speaks about saying no to racism and white supremacy. We all know where white supremacy goes. It goes to genocide. We must stop it now and rip it out, tooth and tong, root and tree. Fierce. The final definition of compassion is mischievousness. We must be mischievous in the face of resistance. This is the most complex and difficult definition that anybody hears. Let me explain first what I mean when I say resistance. In our cultures, we know, and we've been talking about, white privilege. I'll give you an example of white privilege that you're probably aware of, but I'll speak it anyway. And that is, I have great white privilege. Yes, I'm a straight white big guy with a big voice. But where the privilege came from, in many ways, was from my education. My father was a veteran in the Korean War. The GI Bill came over from World War II, and they continued it with Korean War veterans. So he was able to buy a house, his first house, and his education. He got his master's in electrical engineering at NC State, to allow him to get a great job at Bell Labs. So that allowed me to be raised in a nice home and to get a good education myself. At the end of World War II, the GI Bill gave out, at first, 67,000 home loans. 67,000, that's great. Of that, 100 were for African Americans. Yes, that is resistance in a community. They were trying to honor Jim Crow laws, and I grew up in North Carolina. I know Jim Crow laws. I saw them. All the laws that prevented people of color from getting ahead in this world. Our culture was performing a soft racism that was holding people down, unjust. So, okay, Garth, that's resistance. How can you be mischievous in the face of that? Well, we're just experiencing now something that I just saw on the internet this morning. Somebody sent it to me and said, disseminate this as quickly as possible. There is a video out there that shows African-American men, big strapping guys, and they were all wearing black t-shirts. They were wearing black t-shirts over their NFL jerseys. And they were saying, as long as Kaepernick is not hired as quarterback in one of our NFL teams, we will not watch the NFL this year. It's a boycott. They're calling it a man-cot, but it's a boycott. All right? This is mischievous. They are saying to the NFL leaders, you've hired all kinds of people that have done dastardly things. Rapists, murderers, everything else you can imagine. But somebody that takes a knee in silent and peaceful protest is not being hired. It was a very good quarterback, by the way. That's wrong. So, they are being mischievous against the resistance in our culture. Another one that I especially like came out of Windsudel, Germany, in Deutschland. And all the Nazis would come to Windsudel once a year, and they would celebrate with a march. The march was because of the famous Nazi who I can't remember now, Rudolf Hess. Rudolf Hess had been born there and he was buried there in Windsudel, Germany. And for years, they kept coming to town, and the Germans in the town were just like, come on, we don't want to relive this anymore, get out, don't do this. And so they would yell and scream and all those type of things. And so finally in 2011, they actually exhumed Rudolf Hess's body and took down the stone, and they still came. So in 2014, they did something called humorous subversion. They were being mischievous. What did they do? They made it into a fundraiser. Yes, the Nazis would come to town, and they had the whole entire street laid out with banners, and they had the start line, and they had the middle point, and they had the finish line over at the graveyard, and they were yelling and screaming and yay, yay, because every foot that in their progress along this route, people donated money. They had little places where they had piles of bananas. You know how joggers always need to keep carving up during a race. They had one called, with a big sign that says, Mein Month, instead of Mein Kampf. Mein Month, my munch. Things like that. They raised $12,000. You know what it was raised for? To help people that were in the neo-Nazi movement to get out of the neo-Nazi movement. That is mischievous. And so it has spread throughout Germany and in Sweden, and it's being known here in this country. And I gotta tell you, I don't know why they would, but if neo-Nazis came to this town, I would work to organize our own fundraiser for the very same reasons. Which brings me to my last segment of my message today, God's Jiu Jitsu. Now you know in martial arts, Jiu Jitsu is that kind of martial art where you figure out all the leverage that you can have so a smaller person can take on a larger person. And you use that leverage to throw them and defeat them. Okay? That's what Jiu Jitsu is. That's human Jiu Jitsu. God's Jiu Jitsu is very different. And in order to explain that, let me tell you. A couple of weeks ago on our 5th Sunday, we had a special guest, my friend Jim Jacoby. And I don't know whether he told you in the class because I wasn't in there the entire time, but he used to work for Hennepin County. He's retired now. Worked for Hennepin County in one of the hardest jobs on the planet. He worked with young men and teenagers who were in trouble with the law to try to get them psychologically and spiritually back on their paths. These boys haven't learned to trust anyone or anything. Boys filled with great rage who just want to strike out at the world. In order for Jim to do his work, get his way into these angry young men's lives, he would use helpful stories, helpful narratives that the boys themselves could actually see themselves in the story and rethink how their lives might go. And so my good friend Jim was on social media the other day and he posted this that I think is very helpful today when we talk about forgiveness. It's called A Way Back. It is easy to demonize men who are filled with hate. Demonize the hate, not the man. I see these men as open wounds. For a variety of reasons, they have allowed themselves to be filled. And who can endure emptiness for very long? Allow themselves to be filled with hate. They have made a terrible mistake. To only punish them furthers their identification with the destructive, corrosive path. It lowers the odds of them being filled with something constructive and healing. Compassion is an invitation to a way back into membership with a larger community and a chance to discover their true purpose in the arc of their lives. Compassion involves an opportunity to heal the woundedness and grief that masquerades as hate. You know, hate is much simpler. All you have to do is put up barriers of hate, 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 hate. What's more difficult is grief. Because in order to grieve, we must be vulnerable. And of course, vulnerability is the last thing these young men want because they have been so hurt in their lives. This process lets the heat out and allows the cooling. Only when cooled can these men re-enter the community and find a home, maybe for the first time. In my years in Hennepin County working with wounded kids, they would self-describe as angry. Who are you? I'm angry. Who are you? I am angry. It was the only option for them when they had no good reason to trust adults who had so often let them down. In the old stories, when young men returned from war, they were not allowed to re-enter their villages. Instead, they were met by the elders, who had set out huge cauldrons of cold water. These warriors were so hot that when they sat in the water, they caused the water to boil and turn to steam. So they would repeat the process until the water remained cool. This allowed them to go home and be welcomed and to begin the healing. This is God's Jiu Jitsu. This is not throwing the other person down. This is giving them a hand up. Now, it's not always the right time. Sometimes our tenderness is needed. Sometimes our fierceness is needed, and sometimes our mischievous is needed. And they can all run concurrently in our hearts. May we all learn God's Jiu Jitsu in our lives and in our community, so that we too may live God's will. In your name we pray.